Okay, folks, today we're going to talk about the sixth book of Vergil's Aeneid, the halfway point of the epic where he undertakes this journey to the underworld, the land of the dead, to get a view of the stakes of his mission. The ghost of his father has summoned him there at the end of book 5, and this will be our transition point from the Odyssey half. Aeneas has his own journey to the underworld in book 11 of the Odyssey, as we'll see, to the Iliad half in book 7 through 12. So, Aeneas, everybody, they finally get to Italy. Not to Rome's up about it yet. And he's been ordered to find this priestess of Apollo, the Sibyl. He's also told he has to be careful, that he has to tell her prophecies directly to him, because he's told that normally she writes them down, but then whenever anyone goes in the room, the little sheets of paper get all blown all around, and the prophecies get mixed up and jumbled. But he needs a clear one. And she tells him he needs to go get this golden bough from a tree in the forest that will allow him to go to the underworld. It's a gift he will have to give to Proserpina, the queen of the underworld. They get a tour in the underworld, and this becomes the model for Dante's Inferno, which is one of the reasons why Vergil is the guide for Dante the poet in the underworld. And eventually, in the Elysian fields, he meets up with his father Anchises again, who shows him all these eventually to be born famous Romans. So, before we really dive into this, let's take a look at a modern take on the underworld, turning again to Darkness Visible, the book by Ralph Johnson. Remember that Darkness Visible itself is a quote taken from Milton's underworld, Hell, and Paradise Lost. So concerning this descent into the underworld, Nikia in Greek, Ralph Johnson writes, Vergil's Hell, unlike Homer's, is not only a place but also a state of mind and of feeling, not only the location of an event or series of events that are experienced in time, but also a mode of existing which cannot be described or even perceived in terms of the ordinary categories that belong to the realities of time and space. He was interested in trying to imagine and to show the difficulty of imagining, the incomprehensibility not only of the underworld, but also of hell. What Vergil has succeeded in imagining here is darkness visible and vast profundities obscure. So, let's take a look at a new narrative technique, ekphrasis. Ekphrasis is often opposed to narrative because narrative describes an action, while ekphrasis is a description of a work of art. Famous ones include the Shield of Aeneas, the Shield of Achilles, but there are other examples, for example, the temple doors that Aeneas sees in Book 6, carved by Daedalus, who we talked about in our lecture for Aeneid 5. So, an ekphrasis is a description in literature of a physical object. If any specific instance of ekphrasis intrigues the critic, it is usually because its presence in the narrative generally has some symbolic or extra narrative function. Now, one place that you've seen this before are the walls of Juno's temple in Carthage, where Aeneas and his companions see the story of Troy retold in paintings on the wall. And this, emotionally moves Aeneas. And he says, here too, there are tears for things. Sunt lacrima rerum. That even the Carthaginians know about the Trojans and their sufferings. Now, the irony that we as the readers, of course, get, that Aeneas does not at that point, is that these are on the walls of the temple of Juno in Carthage, who hates the Trojans and hates Aeneas. And so even though Aeneas is reading this as sympathy for the Trojans, the intent was probably more, yea, for the Greeks. Even if, Aeneas recognizes himself and other characters there, it's often in the context of, look at Aeneas going crazy on these people. So let's take a look at that one more time. He saw pictured on the walls the whole Trojan War, whose fame had already spread through the world. There were the sons of Atreus, Menelaus, and Agamemnon, their Priam, king of Troy, their Achilles raging at each of them. Aeneas stopped and said with tears in his eyes, "Is there any place on earth, Achates, not filled with our sorrows? Look, there's Priam. Here too honor matters. Here too are tears of the ages and minds touched by human suffering." On one panel, the Greeks are in full retreat with the Trojan youth hard on their heels. A little further, he sees through their tears the snowy canvas of Rhesus's tents. On another panel, Troilus, just a boy and no match for Achilles in combat. And it doesn't go well for Troilus. Meanwhile, Trojan women, their hair streaming, are going to the temple of implacable Pallas. And now Achilles has dragged Hector 3 times around the walls of Troy. So it's basically summarizing not the Iliad necessarily, but the whole Trojan myth. Troilus, for example, doesn't really appear in the Aeneid, but he too has an afterlife in the Western literary tradition. Chaucer writes a Troilus and Cressida about the love affair of Troilus and a Greek Cressida. Shakespeare turns it into a play that wasn't actually performed, which is part of the complicated tradition of Odysseus. We're going to see Odysseus as a hero in the Odyssey, and I like Odysseus, but there are plenty of traditions like Greek tragedy and the Aeneid that see Odysseus, or Ulysses in Latin, as a terrible human being and a emblem of Greek perfidy. So he drags Hector 3 times around the walls of Troy, and now Aeneas recognizes himself in close combat with the foremost Achaeans. So the extra narrative functions are orienting Aeneas to the past, and part of his character growth in the first 4 books is getting out of that. And one of the things that I argued really kind of drives him to make that break is visiting that ersatz Troy that Helenus and Andromache have made out of the palace of Neoptolemus. It gives the audience a kind of backstory previously on, or at some point in Avengers Infinity War explaining like these are what these little pebbles do. And it covers Juno's temple and Aeneas's backstory, which again is an interesting irony. So, again, an ekphrasis is a description in literature of a physical object, usually a work of art. If any specific instance of ekphrasis intrigues the critic, it's usually because its presence in the narrative generally has some symbolic or extra narrative function, like we saw with the paintings on that temple. So now we're going to look at a different temple, the temple to Apollo at Avernus. Avernus is near Cumae in Naples, in Mount Vesuvius in Italy. It was thought of as the gate to hell. Lacus Avernus means the lake of no birds. And I assure you, if you go to Lacus Avernus today, you will certainly not see, among other birds, geese, ducks, seagulls. I saw a falcon there once. It's pretty cool. One time I was going up towards the gate to hell, and from on a wall I saw what appeared to be Cerberus, but it was in fact just 3 cute puppies in a pile all together. So let's take a look at this ekphrasis. So some background information. I talked about this in the last lecture, but King Minos, ruler of Crete, his wife gets it on with this bull because Minos didn't sacrifice the bull. That's where the Minotaur comes from. The Minotaur feeds every couple of years on 14 young Athenians, but Theseus, a young Athenian, sort of the Athens version of Hercules, decides he's going to stop this with the help of a Cretan princess, Ariadne, who gives him the thread to help him find his way out of the labyrinth. He eventually abandons her on the island of Naxos and marries her sister. But she marries Dionysus, so it works out for her too. Daedalus designed the labyrinth. He eventually wants to escape Crete. He builds these wings for him and his son Icarus. Icarus flies too close to the sun, melts the wax. His wings melt away, and he falls into the ocean in a part called the Icarian Sea. So at least he got that. And Daedalus makes his way to Italy, where he builds the gate to this temple. So as we read through the passage describing the gates of the temple of Apollo at Avernus, perform the same sort of analysis that I performed on the images depicting the walls of the temple of Juno at Carthage. Let's figure out what kind of commentary this instance of ekphrasis might have for Aeneid 6. So, on the doors, the murder of Androgeus and the annual penalty for the Athenians. This was the son of Minos. The Athenians killed him. That's why they had to send 14 youths to feed the Minotaur. 7 of their sons offered for sacrifice. The urn stands ready, the lots are drawn. Opposite, rising from the sea, the island of Crete. Raw passion for a bull, in Pasiphae in her furtive position. Remember, Daedalus made a sort of cow suit for Pasiphae to trick the bull into having sex with her. Raising her knees, and there too the mixed breed, the Minotaur, hybrid monument to unspeakable desire. Here the labyrinth winds its inextricable course, and here is Daedalus himself, pitying Princess Ariadne's great love, unraveling the twisted skein of the maze, guiding Theseus's blind footsteps with a thread. Skein is another word for thread. And you also, Icarus, would have played a great part in this masterpiece if grief had allowed. Twice the artist attempted your fate in gold, twice the father's hands fell. Aeneas's eyes would have scanned every last detail, but Hecate sent ahead was back. So, what could we find in here that's strange and meaningful? Well, the Minotaur and how he came to be, that's strange, but is it meaningful? I think the father attempting but ultimately failing to depict his son might be meaningful. So the Minotaur, hybrid monument to unspeakable desire. A monument is literally something that you're expected to remember. And certainly, just looking at this monster, he's hybrid, half man, half bull, to this unspeakable desire that Pasiphae had, inspired by Aphrodite or Venus, Aeneas's mother. A hybrid monument, and unspeakable, the Latin word nephandi. A similar related term, nephos, is used to describe Cleopatra in Book 8, as we'll see. Here the labyrinth winds its inextricable course. An impossible path is what the Latin really means. Twice the artist attempted your fate in gold. Twice the father's hands fell. Daedalus, Vergil, Aeneas, and the failure of art. Something that we go back to the quote of Ralph Johnson. Where he's talking about also a mode of existing which cannot be described or even perceived in the terms of ordinary categories that belong to the realities of time and space. He was interested in trying to imagine and show the difficulty of imagining, the incomprehensibility not only of the underworld but also of hell. And so art attempts to capture meaning, but it cannot capture all meaning. Another way to think about this is that there have been interpretations of the Aeneid for over 2,000 years because we still haven't grasped the full totality of it. That's the mark of a great work of art. I have also said in a previous video that Vergil, I say, is the poet of failure. And I don't mean, again, that I do not mean that he's a failed poet. I mean that one way to read the Eclogues, his early pastoral works, is of the failure of poetry in the real world. A way of looking at the Georgics as the limits and failures of knowledge and teaching, didaxis in Greek. And that in the Aeneid, we can look at what I would say is the failure of history and the things that history can assure. Now, one reason I say that is because I've read a whole lot of Sallust. And I read Sallust and I read Vergil and Horace, for that matter, through a Sallustian lens. And that's partly a product of who my own teacher was, who reads Vergil through a Sallustian lens, and that's why we both went on to work on Sallust. Sallust, too, is looking at the failure of history as well, and how one can even write history in the same time that Vergil is writing his poetry. There's a recent book by Jennifer Garish, who teaches at the College of Charleston about Sallust's histories and wrestling with this topic, that will soon be reviewed in the New England Classical Journal when Dr. Wright finally gets to that. Aeneas's eyes would have scanned every last detail, but Hecate sent ahead was back. So even Vergil is upfront about here that he's not giving you every detail of it. Aeneas doesn't get every last detail of it because he has to move on. Hecate's was now back. So Aeneas fails to see everything, which means that by extension, so do we. So Aeneas encounters a lot of people in the underworld. For example, Palinurus, the guy who fell off the ship, because at least one Trojan had to die on the way. Dido, the second encounter. Deiphobus, who was married to Helen after Paris died, is his third encounter, and then Anchises, his father, is the fourth and climactic one. Now, of course, this echoes, as I said, Odysseus' journey to the underworld in Odyssey 11. For example, the silent encounter with Dido is mirrored by Odysseus' silent encounter with greater Ajax. So, Palinurus, what's his story? So, it's described at the end of Book 5, but he's retelling it here in Book 6. And now there came Palinurus, who, while reckoning their course from Libya by the stars, had fallen from the stern into the waves. He says, "The rudder I was holding to steer our course ripped apart, and as I fell headlong, I dragged it down with me. I swear by the wild sea, I was not so afraid for myself as for your ship." So this is meant to recall Elpenor of Odyssey 11. This is the first spirit that Odysseus encounters as he gets to the underworld. Who's Elpenor? Well, he's one of Odysseus' men while they're spending their time at the palace of Circe on her island. Eventually, Circe says you need to go to see Tiresias in the underworld. He'll tell you how to get home. But they get, one last night of partying. Elpenor gets real drunk, ends up on the roof, forgets that he's on the roof the next morning, walks off, breaks his neck. So he tells Odysseus, "Please make sure you bury me before you leave Circe's island behind for good." Which is, of course, also what Palinurus asks Aeneas. Make sure you bury me. So Dido, well, we know her story from Book 4. And among them, her wound still fresh, Phoenician Dido wandered that great wood. This is really from Book 6, lines 541. The Trojan hero stood close to her there, although, remember, the funeral pyre it mentions at the beginning of Book 5. The Trojan hero stood close to her there, and in the gloom recognized her dim form. "Oh, Dido, so the message is true that you were dead, that you took your own life with steel. Was I really the cause of your death? Seriously, dude?" But Dido kept her own eyes fixed to the ground. This is honestly one of the moments why people think Aeneas, in the words of the late critic Harold Bloom, is a pious prig. Not great with the ladies. But Dido kept her own eyes fixed to the ground. One will also note that the one appearance Lavinia has in the epic, she has no lines. This is the woman the whole war's over in the back half. The one time that she appears, she's in a similar position, but Vergil adds the detail that she blushes at Turnus, which makes it clear that she prefers him to Aeneas. For one reason, Turnus is probably much closer to her own age, and this guy is a 40-year-old widower. So as I said, Dido recalls Ajax in Odyssey 11. We'll get there. Deiphobus, what's his story? And here Aeneas saw Deiphobus, son of Priam, brother of Hector, in Paris. His whole body mangled, his face cruelly mutilated, shredded, and both hands gone. This is what Menelaus and Odysseus did to him. "My own fate, that lethal Spartan woman, plunged me into misery. She left these memorials." You know how we spent that last night in delusive joy. I'll note, too, that this story also gets retold in the Odyssey, in Odyssey 8. And he's referencing to events earlier in the epic, Book 2 of the Aeneid. "I was asleep in her ill-starred bedroom. Why draw it out? They burst into my room, Ulysses with them, the evil counselor. O gods, if my face is pious enough to pray for vengeance." So, as I said, this recalls Demodocus' song in Homer Odyssey 8. What does Demodocus say here? Demodocus sang how one hero here and another there ravaged all Troy, but how Odysseus went like the war god himself with Menelaus to the house of Deiphobus, and there, he said, Odysseus fought the most daring battle and won with the help of Pallas Athena. So note the difference between the world of Homer's heroism and the world of Vergil's, at least the character Deiphobus describes. And this also reflects the difference between Odysseus in Homer and in Vergil. In Odysseus, in Odysseus' version, the Odyssey, it's this great climactic battle where Odysseus proves how great a hero he is. In Vergil's version, Odysseus kind of tortures and kind of goes apeshit on Demodocus. which reflects the way that Ulysses is characterized in the epic. Remember, Aeneid, the member of his crew that they take on in Book 3, he doesn't like Odysseus. He left him on the Cyclops Island. So, as Aeneas is going into the underworld, his sort of final confrontation with the past as it transforms into the future of Rome, we're also walking through the past of the epic, Book 5, Book 4, and Book 2. But at the same time, each new encounter takes Aeneas a further step back in the story as we've seen it. This is going in backwards order. And at this point, the Sibyl interrupts. Night is coming on, Aeneas, yet we weep away the hours. Here is the place where the road splits in two. She's hurrying him on. Vergil will do the same role for Dante in the Inferno. Deiphobus agrees with the Sibyl. He responded, "Do not be angry, great priestess. I will go and return to my place in the shadows. But you, glory of our race, go. Go to a happier place." Now, he's referring, as we'll see, to the Elysian fields, which is where Anchises is. So that's his last encounter, his father Anchises. And what does he show him? The future of Rome, starting with the Roman kings, the first four, Romulus, Numa, Tullus, and Ancus. Then famous Roman republicans, Cato, and here there might be some intentional ambiguity, whether we mean Cato the Younger or Cato the Elder, the Gracchi, the Scipios, the Julii, who will take their descent from Aeneas via Iulus, his son, Julius Caesar, and Augustus. The order of encounters that Aeneas experiences in the underworld mirrors the progress he's made in his own story, only in reverse. We're starting with the kings, then the republic, and then the Julii, the new dispensation. Each encounter brings him further back into his past, back towards the fall of Troy, back towards the point that started him on this seemingly hopeless journey that gave him this huge burden. That is, until he meets his father, who reorients his gaze to the future, and the conclusion of this big, incomprehensible epic, Rome, and specifically Augustus, and Augustan Rome. Aeneas' journey through hell, therefore, has been as much a psychological journey as a literal one. His encounters in the underworld allow him to deal with his past and turn his attention to the future, to hope. It's no surprise, then, that this moment occurs at the end of Aeneid 6, exactly halfway through the text. At this point, the narrative focus of the text will change dramatically from the journeying to the war. All of this makes all the more puzzling or poignant the conclusion to Vergil's Aeneid 6. There are two gates of sleep. One, they say, is horn, and offers easy exit for true shades. The other is finished with glimmering ivory, but through it the spirits send false dreams to the world above. Anchises escorted his son as they talked, then sent him with the Sibyl through the gate of ivory. Wait a second. Gate of ivory. Through its spirits send false dreams to the world above. Aeneas made his way to the ships, rejoined his men, and sailed along the coast to Caitus harbor. They cast anchor from the prow. The sterns faced the shore. So, this passage has been what we'll call vexed through the centuries, because if he's sending him through the gates of ivory, what does that mean for the whole vision that he has just seen? Is it a false hope? Now, in the 20th century, you could divide scholars of Vergil into optimists and pessimists. And another way of framing that was trying to answer the question, was Vergil pro or anti-Augustus? Another term for the pessimists is the Harvard School, in the sense that a lot of them are associated with Harvard. For example, Michael Putnam was educated there, though spent his career at Brown. Richard Thomas is still at Harvard. Ralph Johnson, not Harvard, and yet is of that school of darkness visible. So you can kind of guess where Dr. Wright falls on that divide. The optimist, pro-Augustus school tend to be British. The great exception is the late Latin scholar Oliver Lynd, who has a great book called Further Voices in Vergil's Aeneid, where he too sees more of the unsettling stuff, especially in the back half of the epic that we'll get to. Um, one way that the Harvard School used to be critiqued was that they're all just disillusioned liberals with the Vietnam War. Um, but at the same time, especially in Germany, um, there was a reaction against just seeing the Aeneid as propaganda for Augustus, especially as propaganda had taken on a much kind of darker connotation after the rise of the fascist regimes in World War II. So um, I don't have a solid answer here. I think, beyond saying, I think that Vergil means us to be unsettled, and that Vergil intends this ambiguity without offering us a clear answer. And to close, I'll just give you some historical context as to why I think this is. Augustus ended up living for a very long time. He ended up living for nearly 77 years. This surprised a lot of people because in his youth he was very sickly. He had a very weak constitution. In fact, he almost died before Caesar. We have stories of Caesar sitting at his bedside making sure that he's all right. So it was a surprise to everybody that he lived to see his great grandson and even utter a prophecy that guy over there, you, Galba, you'll be emperor someday. And he was in the year 69, the year of the four emperors. So in the 20s, when Vergil's writing the Aeneid, okay, Antony's gone, the triumvirate's gone. Augustus, as of 27 BC, is in control. But there's still the fear, what happens if he dies? His track record of health wasn't great at that point. This is also the ancient world where, the average mortality was in the 40s, and that's where Augustus was at this point. Vergil would die in 18 BC. And so there's this fear that the civil wars will happen again. That trauma is imprinted all over this epic and all of Vergil's poetry. But Augustus himself also fell very gravely ill in 23 BC, to the point where he started making plans for who was going to succeed him. At that point, it would have been Marcus Agrippa. Conspiracies were formed as a reaction to try to restore the Republic for real. So when Vergil's writing this, he doesn't have the perspective of Ovid, whose entire life has been Augustus, and so has been the Augustan Empire, whose life has thus been one of stability. The longer Augustus lives, the more stable things appear to be. But for Vergil, all of this is still very fresh, and it's not clear how long Augustus is going to live. And so, while what Augustus has brought over the 20s is peace and prosperity, it's certainly not clear to Vergil and Horace in this decade that that's actually going to last. Horace will come around to that position, but that's also because he outlives Vergil by 10 years. And so that's why Vergil might be sending it out, the Aeneas out of the gate of ivory here, because it is a hopeful vision. But Vergil doesn't know when he's writing this, and wouldn't even know in his lifetime, if it was a false hope or not. Okay, so that's the first Odyssey half of Vergil's Aeneid. We'll pick up again with books 7 and 8 as the war in Italy begins.